Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome on the webinar. Thank you for joining us on your lunch break. So we do always appreciate it when people come on the lunch break, and obviously we just said 113 in the room. This webinar was booked out. Obviously, a very popular topic. Obviously, I would imagine most of you have heard me probably speak way too many times on webinars, but I will introduce myself. That is me, Alex O'Neill, Head of Compliance, with a bit of a side-on model shot going on. I'm the Head of Compliance for Code, so my job, for those of you who don't know me, I sit on top of our research and our basically research knowledge consultancy. Is my job in Code, and making sure that the iComply system is as up to date as it possibly can be, and that people who are using it, the templates and the workflow, don't have any trouble when the CQC or HIW or HAS come and inspect your practice. So that's my role within Code, and that's what I do for our members. And I'm joined today by Stuart Man, who is our expert. He's the person that I go to and we go to, but I'll let him introduce himself. This is Stuart.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Stuart Man. I'm from Blue Lemon Safety and Training. For iComply, we do the development, update, checking of all the health safety aspects of the system, and that's our process and our purpose. Our purpose is to make sure that you've got the right information to enable you to cover off everything that you need to do with regards to health safety. And so I'm really pleased to be able to join you this afternoon on this webinar and hopefully share some of my skills and insight with you to enable you to undertake your risk assessments a lot better. And
correct me if I'm wrong, Stuart, you're probably about as qualified as a health and safety person can get.
I have been in the business a lot of years, yes,
yeah.
And I do hold the NEBOSH Level 6 diploma, and I'm also a fellow of the International Institute of Risk and Safety Management. And so it's not just having the qualifications, it's what we do to take them forward.
It's true. I've been working with Stuart very recently on something which we'll talk about towards the end of the webinar. But it's always exciting to find out where is Stuart this week. He's generally off in Dubai running the health and safety for a massive conference, or he's out in India doing something there. So he's very experienced, and he's the person that I turn to when I need advice. So I will skip to the next slide. So today, what are we covering? So why are we doing the webinar is the bit that I'm going to cover first, and mainly it's because of what the CQC are starting to report on more, and we've seen this over the last 12 months. Questions that we are getting asked all the time on the helpline. One of the most common sets of questions we get every single week are about risk assessments. And during health checks, when we send when one of you would like us to come in and have a look at your practice, to either because you feel like you're behind on compliance, or you just want a sense check whether you're doing it the right way, and we come and we do an audit, we're seeing the same issue time and time again, which in a nutshell is risk assessments are being done by people who just don't know how to do them. One thing I will say on that, and that's all about competence, which is on the next point. One thing I will say about that is this webinar most likely will not give you the skills in order to be able to do a risk assessment.
No.
Would you agree, Stuart?
Oh yes. Yeah. But it will enable you to identify the skills that you actually need.
Yeah. Or it will enable you to realise what. Yeah. Well, actually, I think I'm just repeating what you were saying. It will enable you to realise. Well, actually, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. So what should I do? So we're going to talk about competence and what. There's a legal requirement for you to be competent if you're doing a risk assessment, what the law requires, which actually competence comes into that, as I said. What is a risk assessment and the terminology around it? The hierarchy of risk controls, which I've actually retitled the hierarchy of control measures, because for the way it works in the Code iComply ecosystem, it kind of makes a bit more sense. Risk scoring, which is where, to be honest, the majority of time, if something's going wrong with a risk assessment, it is due to the risk scoring. How to follow up from either a risk assessment you've done yourself, what the CQC expect to see, or any regulator, and also and how to follow up if you have an external risk assessment done, which is another place where if you've identified, okay, we don't have the competence, therefore I'm going to pay company Y to do a Legionella risk assessment for me, then what are you supposed to do afterwards? And then when to outsource and what training you can get and where you can go. So that's kind of in a nutshell, that's what we're going to cover today. I'm going to be talking a lot and sort of cueing Stuart in when I feel that he's going to add value, because I've got the expertise of what we're seeing with our members and with our templates, and then Stuart's got the big picture side of things. So I'm just going to move on from that one. So where's this all come from? I mean, this quote here, which I will read verbatim. It says, this comes from a CQC inspection report. The lead nurse had used a template supplied to the practice from a compliance company, most likely us, we are the market leader, to carry out the risk assessment. However, she had not received any training to enable her to competently assess the risks. So some important words there: competent, assessment, but also, I don't know, for those of you, if some of this seems familiar, it's probably because it's from the Being Well-Led webinar, the new Well-Led, and about delegation and management in practice, which I've been talking about a lot recently. Now, one of the things with the CQC, so as I've said with that report, the CQC have started to notice when the risk assessments are maybe not done by a competent person, like we saw on the previous slide. But CQC inspectors are not necessarily trained in risk assessment, are they, Stuart?
Not to that point, not to do with health and safety. And they are, like all professional operators, they have their criteria they work for and their standards. And when it comes to slightly deviating to health and safety from their compliance modes, sometimes they don't fully understand what they're meant to be doing. So
the CQC, they've got a lot. They're coming to your practice and they're spending 8-9 hours in your practice for a day, and they're looking at a whole broad spectrum of things. So they'll pick up your health and safety risk assessment. If it seems all right, and especially around stuff about sharks, which we'll touch on a bit later, if it seems all right, you'll probably pass your inspection. But the CQC are not the guardians of health and safety law. Who would that be, Stuart?
Well, that's the health and safety executive, or for businesses, it may well be the local authority.
So the interesting thing with that is that the CQC might pass you on a risk assessment, but would the health and safety executive feel that it was a good risk assessment carried out by a competent person if they ever investigated your business?
I mean, the chances of something going wrong are quite slim, but the risk assessment is really only looked at following an investigation by the HSE, and they will just go at it line by line to make sure that you've thought of everything and you've come up with this reasonable answer for things.
Brilliant. So I've left that picture on that slide, Stuart, just because I liked it so much.
It's the hotline.
It's the hotline. So that is the hotline that they didn't do a risk assessment. They didn't do any PAT testing or risk assessment on the phone, so unfortunately it's got a little bit too hot. But these are 3 questions that we get asked on probably almost a daily basis. I don't know if we've got anyone from the helpline team in the webinar, but if we are, I think it's daily or multiple times weekly that we're getting asked this, because obviously we're supporting about 2,500 practices out there, so we are constantly answering calls. That's part of the service that we provide. So the first question we get asked is, how do I do this risk assessment? How do I do it? I've got this template in front of me, how do I do it? A second one would be quite often from a nurse who's been delegated this thing. They ring up and they say, who should be doing this, or should I be doing this risk assessment? So who should be doing it? Should I be doing it? Or how do I do this risk assessment? And generally the answers to all of those questions are, if you were competent, you would know.
Yes.
If you've got the training, you would know how to do it. You wouldn't need to pick up the phone because you'd understand the principles of risk assessment. You'd understand the task that you're having to perform. And then should I be doing this risk assessment? Generally speaking, if someone's picking up the phone to ask us that question, I can almost guarantee you the answer is no. Sound right?
No, that is. It's about having the right skills to be able to undertake the task. And if somebody asks you to deliver a package, then if you're competent to drive and you can walk and you can navigate the streets, then you have the skills to do that. And if you didn't have a driving license and somebody said, "Can you deliver this package?" then you said, "I don't drive."
Exactly.
Instantly, you know whether you've got the competence or not.
We're going to get to where you can get training and what that's about. The last one says, code practice inspections. I wanted to put a percentage on this, and I was asking Claire, who I work with, what percentage do we think? I'd say it's a high majority. I don't want to put a number on it, but it's above 75% of practices we visit. I'd say at least one risk assessment isn't fit for purpose or has been done by someone that isn't competent. Obviously, iComply gives you all the tools, but you need to be competent to use them. So, what is competence? Stuart, do you want to sort of go through this slide and explain it from the sort of the legal, and then obviously I know there's a couple more slides, so if you want to touch upon this.
I mean, there is this terminology, it's someone who has the necessary skills in the area that they're assessing, and the experience, and we all gain experience over time, and the knowledge on what they're actually assessing. And if they can understand the task and have actually completed that task several times, they'll know what can go wrong, what can go right. But if they don't understand the task, or it's something new, or it's an area where they haven't received enough training, or haven't received enough experience, then what they see as the hazards and the risks is actually going to be slightly different.
We're going to touch on that a bit later.
Yeah, they may well cover everything they need to cover, but is that by more luck than judgment?
And it's kind of we're going to cover that when we get to the risk scoring, but it's a really good point. It's like, if you don't know what could go wrong, you can never do the risk assessment.
You can't change it. It's like anything. If you want to change something, you've got to measure it. If you want to lose weight, you stand on a set of scales, and then you make a choice of changing things, and then go back, just like with risk assessments, and reassess them on an annual basis, or more often if required, to see whether you're doing the right thing. But one of the things about risk assessments is they're not just a piece of paper, they're a process. So you do a risk assessment, you identify a hazard, or what could be a serious loss event from an injury or financial loss, and you implement controls to reduce that. But implementing controls, as we know with everything, costs money. So whoever's carrying out the risk assessment needs to have the ability to influence people.
That's why it's good that if it's a well-trained practice manager, is quite good, or the principal, because they can actually then make the changes, buy the thing they need to buy, change the piece of equipment.
This is it. I mean, it doesn't always have to be expensive, and it's not about having a process for spending money. It's some of the time, in fact most of the time, it's about saving money.
If you can eliminate something. I'm conscious of we probably want to. No, it's fine, no problem. We just want to move on from this one. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, it's a legal document. And there's personal liability in it, which is very different from other things in a practice. So, for example, if you're working in a practice and you knock over a cup of water and it breaks a printer, then it's an accident, and your boss actually can't deduct pay for accidents. That's in your contract, and it's part of employment law, unless there's negligence. But that's. I mean, I can't imagine that someone's going to make a big deal out of that. However, with a risk assessment, if you did the risk assessment and someone got hurt, then you are personally liable. Isn't that right, Stuart?
It is, and it is right at the very end of the line, and it doesn't happen very often. But remember, fines and imprisonment are personal things. They're nothing that your insurance will cover. They will cover a claim for compensation and even damage to the equipment. But if you're found to be, and it sounds horrible, but criminally liable, then fines and imprisonment are a personal thing. There are very few people who are actually prosecuted to that level. But I use the word few because there are some people in prison.
Well, the interesting thing is, and I put on there, the bottom line is, would you be comfortable standing in a courtroom explaining why you were competent? or why you delegated it to someone who wasn't competent. If for the practice owners who are in here thinking, oh, I give that to my manager's job is to do the risk assessment, then yes, their job may be to do the risk assessment, but your job, unless they came with that skill, is to make sure that they're trained to do it. There's a duty on the employer to make sure that the employee is appropriately trained to do the job, the new task that they're being asked to do that they didn't have the skill from before. Isn't that right?
It comes down to this, you can delegate responsibility, but you can't delegate accountability.
And the interesting thing that you did, I love that saying, the interesting thing, and that's actually in my well-led webinar, the interesting thing as well, which you touched on before, is, so let me get this straight, there's an insurance aspect here as well.
Yes.
So if your risk assessment, if I delegated my risk assessment to my nurse or my practice manager who isn't been appropriately trained, and then the practice burns down because of something that wasn't picked up on the risk assessment, I'll be all right with my insurance, right?
Well, it's until you read the small print, and everybody gets caught out with the small print.
Yeah.
And generally the terminology is that you'll be following what are seen as reasonable practices. And then they use the HSE documentation and guides to define what is reasonable. And if you've been unreasonable, you didn't carry out a fire risk assessment, you didn't monitor, manage, inspect, even monitor your cleaning, and the practice burnt down, they'll come back and say, well, actually, some of this is your responsibility, so the total payout, we're going to suggest 50% to you and 50% to us. And so what you get back could be drastically reduced, or even none at all.
Okay, so they could turn around and say, your risk of fire was assessed by someone who wasn't competent, therefore you missed these essential things. Sorry, mate, it's all on you.
Yes, insurance companies are like any other business. They will pay out where they need to, but where they can get away with it, especially if it's a big claim, they will go out of their way to put the onus back on yourself. Okay,
brilliant. I know we spent quite a bit of time on that slide, but I think that was really important. And someone said scary stuff. I mean, this is all worst case scenario. This doesn't happen often, but it's just important to understand that this is, when we're doing compliance, and I don't really like that term, doing compliance, we generally just think, well, we've got to update our policies, we've got to do our risk assessments, we've got to do our audits, but we don't always think, well, hold on, what is requiring us to do this? What is the law around this? What are the implications of me doing this or of me giving this to somebody else? And I think that there's potential issues in practices if something goes wrong.
Yes.
So what I want to do, I'll just cover this slide really, really quickly because there's a lot more that we need to cover.
There is.
But the laws that we're meeting are the Health and Social Care Act, the Regulated Activities Regulations 2014, and then you've got the Health and Safety at Work Act, the regulations there, which were the Management of Health and Safety at Work regs. Did I get that right?
They are, and I'll just point out here. I may sound like a turkey voting for Christmas, but the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999 is a HSE document. It's freely available. And it's what managers in all businesses should be doing to manage their safety. And it's freely available. Go onto the HSE website or just Google it, and the document is there. And this is what they expect you to do. It's the guidance for managers.
Brilliant. So what we've got there is, if we look at the Health and Safety at Work Act, it says every employer shall make a suitable and sufficient assessment. So they've got to do that for their employees. And also the safety of people not in their employment that arises from them having that business. So we'll see that this makes a difference. It's not just, you don't just have to do a health and safety risk assessment for your building or the other ones. When we're talking about domiciliary care, if you are taking a nurse, which you should do, you must take someone with you when you go on a domiciliary care visit, more on this later, you must risk assess the environment that you're taking that person into. And obviously the Health and Social Care Act, Regulation 15 basically says that your premises has to be safe, and Regulation 12 says you can only do treatment in a place that is safe, and they both talk about doing risk assessments. So there's multiple laws here. So it's not a huge thing, but it is something that we need to take seriously in practice. Now, the basic terminology I'm going to let Stuart cover this, so because these are the things that appear on the risk assessment forms. Would you like to cover this, Stuart?
Yeah, I can do. Terminology that we use, and the first one here is risk. Risk is a chance of something going wrong. What's the risk? Some people play the lottery, there's a risk. There's a chance of winning, but there's a bigger chance of losing. And so everything we do in life is a risk, from running a business to actually just going into somewhere, to driving down the road. Within these risks, we have things called hazards, things that have the potential to cause harm. But for a hazard to cause harm, there has to be a hazardous event. There has to be a wet or a floor. The floor is wet, so we've got the risk is the floor, the hazard is the wet floor, and then the hazardous event is somebody slipping on that wet floor. Then we look at two other bits of terminology. The likelihood. Well, actually, how likely is it to happen? We've opened the door, haven't realised it, and members of the public can walk in, and we haven't sealed off the area. Well, it's very likely. Or we've actually kept the door locked, or we've segregated it with some signage, and so people are going to have the risk and the hazard identified to them. And that brings us on to the fourth one, which is the severity. We have all fallen over many, many, many times from small children, but as we get older, the severity of a fall, especially if we knock our head or we're an elderly person and we break a neck or femur, very, very common. And so we need to look at the overall risk of everything, but then identify our hazards. But to control a hazard, you need to know what can go wrong.
And the likelihood of it and how bad it could be.
How likely it's going to be and what the outcome could be.
What's a risk assessment then, Stuart?
Well, a risk assessment is a careful examination of your work environment, from the building to the processes to the people to who comes in, who comes out, so that you can manage the risk, the chance, the likelihood and severity of ill health, injuries, to what we call a reasonable level. The official term is so far as is reasonably practical, which a reasonable person would look at.
So don't go overboard.
It's not about going overboard.
Don't spend a fortune.
It's about doing the simple things, and that's what we're looking at, doing the simple things.
Brilliant. So, when we actually come to risk assessment and actually doing the risk assessment, obviously a lot of you are iComply members. We've said that we've got a handful of non-members in the room. But you're probably familiar with this form. Who recognises this form on the left of the screen? The M250B, as I like to call it. It's the health and safety risk assessment. Now, generally, this is the form, one of the forms that most practices choose to do in-house if they're going to do one of the risk assessments, and it's the one that sees a lot of errors. So I'm just going to talk to you about how I would do it, based on what I know, and then we'll go into where people make errors and the likelihood and severity issues that people have. So firstly, as we said, it must be performed by a competent person. If I gave you that and you're just like, what am I supposed to do with this? Then you're not competent. Or how do I do this? You don't know. You've not had the training. So the way I like to see is what I do with it first is I go from the top to the bottom, and then I go from left to right. So top to bottom is the rows of the risks that I'm assessing. So you can see here we've got waste, lead foil and asbestos. So I go through the template from the top to the bottom, and the reason I put this page up is because if I have a digital x-ray system, then lead foil is completely irrelevant to my practice. We don't have it. So I would just delete that whole row from the risk assessment. You could leave it in and put NA. There's a small chance that you'll forget about it, and if you're rushing, you'll put a score by it. So I would just go top to bottom through the whole form, delete any risks, any rows that don't apply to me, and also add rows that code may not have considered. The key message here is it is a template. You are supposed to edit it and adopt it and adapt it before you use it. And I know that's probably I would imagine, as always, the people that we have in the webinar are not the people that need this message. But thank you for joining. So I go from the top to the bottom and I add and remove risks as applicable to my practice. So the rows. What I then do is I'm going to add or remove control measures. So I'm going to have a look at those and say if we took something like sharps, I'm going to look at the template control measures and they're all in square brackets. Now, one of the reasons we added square brackets to them this year is because practices were just leaving them all in. So we put those square brackets in to make you think, is this control measure in my practice, or is it a control measure I want to consider? So I would go down, so it's very easy to see the practice. If the square brackets are there, you've probably not edited it properly. If I see in say sharps, I see safer sharps are used, and then down at the bottom we've got whole things of procedures about recapping, then are you using safer sharps? Are you not? So we so I will add or remove control measures as applicable to my practice, removing the square brackets, and then I'm going to score the risks for the hazard, the likelihood times severity, which we're going to go into quite a bit of depth in a minute, after the control measures. So what is the overall risk score for that particular event or risk with the control measures in place that we have chosen? I'm then going to create some actions, because what I might have done is looked at this and gone, we need to get a new control measure, we need to do something differently. So I might create some actions which I'll schedule as to-dos in iComply, and then I'm going to deal with them and follow them up. I'm going to, if I'm using any external companies, I'm going to make sure that I read their risk assessment, which probably has an action plan in it, and I'm going to probably copy and paste that action plan into a to-do related to-do in iComply, and I'm then going to manage those things. I'm also going to email, I think I've got this on a later slide, but if I disagree with the risk assessor, if I've used an external company, I'm going to do that all in writing so I have an audit trail. And I'm then going to train my team on the risk assessment. I'm going to explain the control measures for them and make sure that we do what we say we're going to do. So that's pretty much just sort of using the templates, using external companies. Those are sort of the key things that you need to do. Now, this is usually called the hierarchy of risk controls, right, Stuart?
Yes, that's the general terminology for it.
But I've renamed it hierarchy of control measures just because I think it just makes more sense with where that sits on our template, just for the purpose of talking about this. And this is sort of, there is a hierarchy. When you're managing risks, there are things that you are supposed to do first. I mean, at the top of that one is just to eliminate the risk. Okay, so there was regulations that came in 6 years ago that as a profession we may or may not be complying with. And those are the safer sharps in healthcare regulations 2013. Now, what those regulations, have you come across those, Stuart?
I have, yes.
Brilliant. So you correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, because I've run through this with you, but it'd be really good just to make sure I get it right. But the safer sharps and regulations basically says that you must reduce the risks associated with the use of traditional sharps, and where reasonably practicable, replace traditional sharps with safer sharps. Am I right?
That's correct.
Right.
Correct.
So, number one on your hierarchy of risk control, so when you're doing a sharps risk assessment, number one is eliminate, which means completely remove the hazard. So in healthcare, this is why, as a profession, nurses are no longer supposed to handle sharps. Because if you eliminate a person doing a task that has a risk associated with it, that is unnecessarily, there's no reason that nurses need to be handling sharps. The dentist is giving the injection, the dentist is the only person who needs to handle that needle. And talking about need when we're reducing risk. So that's why, as a profession, we went, okay, nurses no longer handle sharps. So then the second one, reduce, what does reduce mean, Stuart?
It means reduce the either potential for harm, or reduce the amount we're using, or actually plan for some change very near in the future and say, right, we will extinguish our current stocks, and then in 6 months' time,
Change the process.
Yeah.
Or using safer equipment over a period of time. So when I'm putting this in context with sharps, because sort of rule number one was eliminate people who eliminate, so nurses can't handle them. So then the second level down, the dentists have to be handling them. So your next hierarchy, and this is HSE's hierarchy as well.
Yes.
It's the IOSH hierarchy, which we'll get onto what IOSH are in a bit. So number two is use safer equipment. So that's why as a profession, we've had to start using safer sharps. Unless you can come up with a very good reason in your risk assessment why you can't, and there are a few examples which I won't go into in this webinar of where you could continue to use traditional sharps. However, I am aware of practices, there's a few practices, or one practice in particular in Scotland, that were investigated by Scottish HSE, which has gone self-funding.
Yes.
Has gone self-funding, the same as the HSE in England has. We've just not seen this happen yet. And they went into a dental practice and they said, okay, you're still using traditional sharps. And they were like, it's okay, we've done a risk assessment. They gave them the risk assessment, and the risk assessment says, we've looked at safer sharps, we don't like them. And they said, okay, have you trialed every single safer sharp system in your practice in order to be able to say, we don't use safer sharps because they're a greater risk? Or have you tried one system and one person had an issue, and therefore you've decided that the whole range of products is not suitable? I can't remember how big the fine was, but I think it was in the multiples of thousands. So that's just to bear in mind. So this is when we may just see it as like, oh, we really like using, I don't want this webinar to be about sharps. This isn't what it's about. So do you know what, I'm going to move on from that point. But, so eliminate, remove the hazard, reduce. So prevent contact, you can use a guard or something like that. Safe system of work, you can sort of come up with a system that you put in place that generally doesn't happen in dental practice. It's more on building sites, putting in the safe systems. And then PPE, obviously, is wear your gloves, and that's what we all do, but that's your last one. So, common practice errors, what do we see? Practices use templates, they don't ask risk, they don't add the risk specific, which we've already covered, or they don't remove the risks that aren't applicable. It says they're using lead foil, they've scored the risk, and the CQC come in, or someone will come in, and it's obvious that they've just fudged the template and rushed it because they're assessing things they don't have. So it's obvious that they've not done it properly. They don't add or remove control measures. For example, they say they use safer sharps and they're not. They misunderstand the risk scoring and attempt to make the practice look overly safe. They score lower than is actually the case, and to be honest, lower than is actually possible for that particular risk, which we're going to cover in a minute. They score the severity too low. So it's critical to remember, we're going to cover this again in a second, it's critical to remember that control measures, generally speaking, only reduce the likelihood something's going to happen. The severity, if I stick a needle in my hand, the severity is still going to be the severity. I may be able to reduce the likelihood that that needle's going to go in my hand,
but the severity is very different.
I still could get Hep B or HIV or something, and the severity is still the severity. And they perform risk assessments without any training, which is what we've been discussing all along. So risk scoring, Stuart, can you take us through risk scoring?
Risk scoring, we use those two bits of terminology that we mentioned earlier on, which was the likelihood, the chance of something happening, and severity, how bad it would be. And if we look on the right hand side, on the severity side, we've gone from minor, cuts, lacerations, sprains, right through to major, life-changing injuries, or even, God forbid, death. And so we need to judge the severity, how bad it could really be. We then look at the likelihood, and on the left-hand column we've got unlikely, improbable, 1 in a million, and right down to possible. Yeah, this could happen once a year or more, and likely weekly or more often. And so when we look at a hazard and a hazardous event, we say, how likely is it to happen? Well, actually we have, to use the example earlier on, a wet floor on the way into the practice because we're doing our cleaning. And we keep the door locked and segregated. So the severity on that isn't going to change, because slipping on a wet floor,
you're still going to fall over and potentially break a leg, probably.
Yeah. So the severity is going to be between 2 and 3. but it's going to be unlikely. If we don't have any suitable control measures in there, and we let people walk through and staff are in the habit of just walking past and not following the control measures, then it's going to be fairly likely. But even if it's just a sprained ankle, that could be a staff member off work for a week. So there's a financial cost to that. But when we look at the severity, it's very, very difficult to reduce down the severity because a fall is a fall, a needle stick is a needle stick.
So that's kind of a key message for us, is your control measure isn't going to reduce the severity. So it's also important to remember that it's maths, it's a multiplication. Yeah. You're doing likelihood multiplied by severity. So we'll get onto that in a sec on the actual. So we'll look at that with the actual. Have I got it on this one? Or? Yes, it's on this slide. So the likelihood multiplied by the severity. So risk scoring tips. Don't score each control measure. We're going to see that in a second. And now this is probably the most important tip. So this is how I do a risk assessment, and I am trained, but I wouldn't touch fire or Legionella because I'm not competent to assess those things, which we'll get on to later. But think what the risk score would be without any control measures, right? So if you take something like an autoclave, okay, so if you're competent and you know enough about autoclaves, and you know, Stuart, that if that pressure vessel isn't checked every year with the control measure of checking, if it's not serviced, then what could happen? What could happen to it?
I mean, if you get a fracture in that vessel and there's a release of energy, gas, or it explodes, then
you got the key word there. The worst case scenario with an autoclave, if it's not checked, is that it explodes through pressure equalization, which I won't go into in this webinar. It will explode. And I remember a few years ago seeing a newspaper article where an autoclave had flown through an interior and an external wall of a practice and had landed in the middle of the road. Yeah. So we don't have any control measures in place. I'm thinking, as I said on the second bullet, what is the risk score without any control measures? So what do we reckon, everyone? On 1 to 3, from hardly anything to potential death, what is the severity? What is the potential severity if an autoclave explodes? Can everyone score me 1 to 3 right now? 1. Okay, so it's 3. Now, so we've got 3, that's our severity. Right, so if we don't do any control measures, it's never checked, it's never anything, what's the other number? Can everybody give me that now? Is it improbable, is it a 1, or is it highly likely, is it a 3? Okay, so we've got 3, so this is without any control measures, so it's likely that it's going to happen.
Yep.
So what's the total risk score there, everybody? We've got 1, 3, it's multiplied by 3. We've got a 9. I'm enjoying this exercise, this is good. Okay, so we're going to do the next bit. So we've now got control measures in place. We've got it's being checked, we've got annual checks, we've got the hydrostatic test, it's all happening, hydrostatic tests are extinguishers, in cylinders. Yeah. So all the tests are happening.
It's maintained,
it's
properly cleaned, it's properly used.
Mm-hmm.
And the staff using it are able to spot any errors that could be occurring when it's in use, whether it's losing pressure, not working properly.
Right, so can everyone put after control measures, what's the likelihood that it's going to happen, everybody? We've got all these control measures in, what do we think? It's a 1. Okay, so that's great. So everyone's got a 1. I'd agree with that. What's the severity? If it explodes, it's a 3, so what's our risk score? What's our total risk score? It's a 3, fantastic. So it was a 9,
and
we've put control measures in place, we've now reduced it to a 3. That's brilliant, that's how you risk score.
Yeah, we haven't changed the severity, but the advantage of risk scoring is that it gives you, obviously the higher the number, the more focus you need to put on that. And so it enables you to put them into a hierarchy of what you need to deal with first.
Here's examples of what we see. This practice has scored every single control measure. They've not removed the square brackets. They've left the other in red. They've also, what would we say about even if those control measures were correct? What's the potential severity of a Sharps injury, everybody? What number would we give It's a 3. Brilliant. Okay, I'm enjoying this webinar. It's very
No, do you know what? It's really good that
yeah.
you've grasped the severity side.
Yeah, I think
really
that's probably the most important lesson apart from the competence side.
Yeah.
So we know that probably after risk scores there should just be a single 3 there, like we've seen on. Oh no, not on this one. They've scored the whole thing a 1, but they've not actually edited the control measures at all, and there could be problems there. So this one.
Safer sharps.
And it still looks like a template, absolutely. So this one is still it's better, but it's not competent.
No.
It's not good. This last one, the only potential issue with this, the risk score is probably right. However, it does say in here that they're using safer sharps and that they're recapping needles. And I would say technically, if you're using a good one of the good safer sharp systems, one of the proper ones, you will never be recapping.
But it actually looks like somebody's gone in, amended it, adapted it to your needs, and done a nice risk score from that as well.
So, on this particular one, how to follow up, if you're an iComply member, use iComply. That's what it's there for. That's why the boss probably brought it. They want to see this transparency. Even if you're using an external company, you can upload the risk assessment into iComply. So use iComply, you can upload it using, you can see there the link or upload document, so you can upload it, scan it in, or something like that. If you're filing at the bottom, say where you filed it. I put this one in folder 2, as you can see there. Sign off your activity with informative notes. So you can see here that I've read, we used an external company for our risk assessment, everything was fine. However, we've got some broken tiles that need fixing on the external stair, so that is potential 3 severity head injury. So that's something we need to deal with quite urgently. And then you can see what I've done is I've actually used the related to do feature above, and I've scheduled that in my diary for it to be dealt with. So I've got all of that so far. So use the related to do feature exists in iComply for you to schedule follow-up actions, mostly after risk assessments or audits. So I would use it. As I said earlier, if you disagree with an external assessor, challenge any findings by email, and provide training, delegate actions in team meetings so that you've got that audit trail as well, that you've shared learning or you've discussed it with the team. So I'm going to move on from that one. iComply templates. I won't go through these point by point or something like that. But these are examples of ones that we have in iComply. M250B is the health and safety risk assessment that you review annually, but you also want to use an individual bespoke copy of it if you're having to do, if you've got any young team members, any pregnant team members, something like that. But that covers like your radiation and your sharps assessments as well are within that assessment. And there's a difference here between things that you do sort of ad hoc, so say the risk assessment for Hep B nurses and the things that you have to have regularly and keep up to date, which would be your COSH assessments and things like that. Right at the top, I don't know if anybody's noticed, Stuart and I have been working on very closely on with Claire as well. To be honest, mostly Claire. She's not here. I don't know why I'm pointing over here. Mostly Claire has been working on.
Legwork.
She's done a lot of very good work on this. And coming in a few weeks, we have a full domiciliary care set for you coming into iComply. That's going to have a domiciliary care environmental risk assessment, which will be the risk assessment that a competent team member performs when they step out of that car and before they go into the property. So that's a really good piece of work that Stuart's been helping us with, so hopefully everyone's going to be really happy with that. So, a really important question that we get asked on the phone lines all the time is, when do I outsource? When should I use an external company? And the bottom line is, what do you say, Stuart?
Well, if your staff are competent and you have confidence in them, then the majority of your risk assessments you could actually undertake yourself. There are some specialised areas.
So this is the question I wanted to ask you. Like, so for example, I'm IOSH trained. I've been on a 3-day course. I feel comfortable with the health and safety risk assessment template. Cliff, who's our many hats manager, iComply product owner, tech events, and he helps with the building here. Cliff does the health and safety risk assessment for this building. But I've witnessed a fire risk assessment, and I've been there with a fire risk assessor where they've been telling me that this door conforms to the old fire standard and is now too thin to be a proper fire door. I don't feel like I would ever, even with my training as head of compliance at Code, I don't think I would ever feel competent to do a fire risk assessment. Do you do the fire risk assessment of Blue Lemon?
Actually, I don't.
Really?
Because, again, I am not a competent fire risk assessor. I have a director who is and who undertakes this, but undertaking a fire risk assessment is very, very different from a general risk assessment. Undertaking a pressure vessel check needs to be a specialist, a Legionella check needs to be a specialist, and so you are not going to be able to do absolutely everything yourself. But the majority of things, it's like with your car. You can service your car, you can change the oil, check the tyres. You can't MOT it because you need a specialist for that final bits.
So I think the key message here is, there are risk assessments that with training you can do yourself and with competence. There are somewhere I've been to practices where the practice manager was an old plumber and another practice manager who had been in the fire service. So I was there saying, are you sure you want to do this yourselves as a practice? And they were like, well, I was in the fire service for a decade, so fair enough, no problem with that. So just bear that in mind. Legionella, certain things you should do in-house, certain things you may want to just outsource. We'll get to questions in one sec. This is just probably the bottom line is with training there is pretty much an established course at the HSE and everybody sees as
it's the industry standard.
Industry standard. Kate, we will get to the questions. Sorry, Katie. I think we'll get to the questions in a second. So the industry standard, it's a 3-day course. Stuart, do you just want to cover what's in it?
Yes, I mean we're a training company as well, and so this is the IOSH Managing Safety course. It's set as the industry standard. It's managed by IOSH, the Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and it's certificated through them. This is a 3-day course that we're going to be running in March. It's specifically aimed at you people, so it won't be just a general course so anybody can turn up from any industry. This one will be tailored around your needs, and the examples that we use on the course is to enable you to develop your skills, to enable you to do general risk assessments. We have arranged through Code a fairly substantial discount. Our price is fairly cheap anyway. We've got 18 spaces available, and if following this you feel that you need some more advice or that this will be something worthwhile for your staff, please let us know. Uckfield is near...
It's near Crawley.
Yes.
What we're going to do is, IOSH is there are multiple providers running multiple courses. It is the accepted thing. It's what I have. It's what Cliff has. And we've got about a few other people in Code that has it. IOSH is kind of the governing body of health and safety professionals, or one of them. And this is seen as the standard qualification. You don't need to. We'd love for you to go on Stuart's course. It's not about. We're not here to sell Stuart's course. This is something that we feel would benefit practices, and there's probably a local provider near you as well. If you're nowhere near Uckfield, then you might not want to come to this one. But Stuart's going to do a 15% discount, bringing it down from I think it's about $340 to $289 for our members. He's doing it next year for 3 days. If you are interested, there's the phone number on the slide. Give us a call. Press option 1. We'll pass your details on to Stuart.